Hi, I'm Benjamin Studebaker.
And I'm Aimee Terese, and this is What's Left. Patron side.
So today on What's Left, we're going to talk about co-ops. And we're going to talk about co-ops in two specific different contexts. So one is the idea that co-ops ought to be something that we create within a capitalist context in an effort to change our system over time, to build some level of worker power through these co-ops, and then use those co-ops to try to achieve some kind of more ideal socialist system in the future. And the other is a more normative maximalist notion, which views co-ops as the goal of socialism, or as a principal goal, that the aim of socialism ought to be to get everybody working for co-ops, and that's what emancipation from capitalism entails. And Aimee and I think that both of these positions are wrong. We are not very bullish on co-ops, and we aim to show you why. So the arguments that people make about in favor of co-ops, they argue that co-ops legitimate a power relationship, the workplace power relationship, because they democratize that relationship. So many people think that power relationships aren't legitimate unless they're democratic. I don't think that's what we think, Aimee. I think we think that the workplace relationship is intrinsically illegitimate regardless of how it's governed and regardless of how it's constructed. In much the same way that libertarians think that the state is illegitimate regardless of what system of government is collecting the taxes.
Yeah, I mean, to clarify, I think there could be some semantic confusion, so I just want to delineate. When we say workplace, what we mean is a place where you need to work in order to, whether you're selling your labor power or whether it's even somewhere that you must work out of a sense of coercion in order to earn the means of subsistence.
Subsistence.
Right.
Yeah, the thing that's distinctive about the workplace here is that the workplace is something that you have to get involved with, because if you don't get involved with it, you will be denied what you need to live. And we think that that in and of itself is wrong. The fact that you're pushed to enter the workplace to earn the means of subsistence. We think that people are or ought to be entitled to the means of subsistence regardless of whether or not they decide to do some kind of work.
Yeah, to me, and, this is a concept we use regularly all the time. It's the idea that coercion vitiates consent, right? So somebody's holding a gun to your head and you submit and consent to whatever it is they're asking you to do. No legal system and no reasonable human being would take that as meaningful consent, right? You literally are doing what needs to be done in order to survive. And so to my mind, a workplace relationship which contains that degree of coercion is fundamentally illegitimate. And I find with co-ops, people start splitting hairs about, the textual definitions of exploitation. And to me, that's a complete fucking waste of time. To me, it's an exploitative, dominating relationship if you are forced gun to your head to work in order to survive.
And the sense in which a gun has been put to your head is that if you don't work, you will be denied food, you will be denied the money that you need for rent, for shelter, for housing, for clothes, for an education, for healthcare. All of these things will potentially be taken from you if you don't work. And changing the way that the work is managed doesn't change the fact that you are still being told, work or die. So when we talk about co-ops, That's a reason why, from a normative standpoint, we really don't like them as a maximalist approach, because I think, Aimee, we both would like to see, in some ideal circumstance, a world where there really is a choice about whether or not we go to work. And we think that that's what the end goal of this all ought to be.
And again,
a real meaningful choice about what you do with your time.
Whether or not we go to work, as in whether or not we need to work to earn the means of subsisting, right? So
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you've got a real choice, if you really have freedom, the kind of freedom that we want socialism to provide, then you have an option to just sit around and make art that nobody would be interested in, that you don't sell to anybody, and hang out with your friends and
tinker.
Go
if you
for
want
coffee.
To tinker with shit.
Yeah, just screw around. You don't have to make it for other people. You don't have to sell it on a market. You don't have to do any of that stuff. And perhaps you can if you want. Perhaps there's still some kind of ancillary market, but it can't in any way be tied to the means of subsistence. If the market is tied to the means of subsistence, then that means it's going to be treating people in an unacceptable way. Of course, we're quite well removed from that kind of ideal society. And so a lot of people argue that co-ops are something that we might do in the meantime to try to get to some other state of affairs, emphasizing in part the decline of the labor unions. So, for instance, people argue that because the unions are declining, perhaps cooperatives could be a replacement institution for that, or could raise consciousness, educate people, make them more aware, help organize them in some way.
I think the primary argument that I see is one that suggests that it makes the experience and the ramifications of that currently necessary relation of you to a boss for money, that it makes that ultimately less problematic, right? Like, it will make your workplace more equal. You'll get better pay. You'll get better hours, better holiday provision. You'll get, just a far more pleasant and enjoyable and democratized workplace. The democratization of the workplace is, I think, the really key facet of many people's arguments for this. They really lean in on the idea that democratization is like a good in and of itself, right? And the I guess the arguments for that as like a goal, I think are not sufficiently made. It's sort of democratization is taken as like an a priori goal.
Yeah, because there's this assumption in our society that democracy in and of itself is adequate justification for any proposal. That if something is democratic, it's intrinsically good, which I think is naive.
Exactly. And we want to challenge that in relation to the workplace. Because I think that, like, in using it as this like a priori good, right? Like, that doesn't need to be justified. It's an end in itself, right? Is the way that it's often utilized in relation to co-ops. And I think that, like, and correct me if I'm mistaken here, Benjamin, but I think the way that we would sort of suggest is that, like, not only does that not in any way overcome that workplace coercion, like, the fact of needing to work in order to survive is not in any way ameliorated by changing the form of the relationship that you have with your boss, right? And so, to my mind, like, democratized or not democratized is in no way like a qualitative or transformative distinction. And I want to go even one further. Yeah, so
it's an attempt to legitimate that.
Yeah, and I want to go even one further and suggest that, like, I actually think counterintuitively, I don't think that workplace democracy is either better necessarily or even as good as a hierarchical workplace, which is to say, I think in many ways there would be a lot about co-ops that would in fact be worse. And I think in never making the argument for democratization, a lot of the people advancing co-ops are like totally failing to contend with many of the best arguments against them, right? They're leaving themselves vulnerable to attack by never actually making the case for the democratization. And yeah, I guess we want to challenge that. But then my other main concern is that, like, basically, I think it substitutes like workplace relations for structural relations. And I don't think it in any way changes like the fundamental class composition of society or, the competitive aspects of living in a capitalist order. Like, it just does very little to attend to most of the problems and contradictions that capitalist production presents to
right,
us.
Because the internal governmental structure of a firm doesn't change the fact that that firm has to compete for market share with other firms, and those competitive incentives cause the firm to try to push down its cost, including its labor costs, and it encourages the firm to make things that are going to be saleable on a capitalist market, which could be in all manner of ways useless, inefficient, unproductive. All of the central market failures that we see under capitalism can still occur under a co-op system. It's just that the internal governance of the co-op system is a little bit different. Just like you can have a capitalist society that's a representative democracy, or you can have a capitalist society that is a Kaiserreich. The form of the political institution doesn't change the economic system that is occurring, and changing the political system of the firm, the corporate governance of the firm, does not fundamentally change the exploitative system that exists. Now, some people will argue that having co-ops encourages economic policies that are more benevolent, in much the same way that having universal suffrage at the political level encourages economic policies that are more benevolent. But part of the problem is that if co-ops were competitive under the extant rules, then we would already be seeing a lot more of them. The fact that we don't see very many co-ops, and when we do see big, powerful co-ops, they often emerge from wartime or post-war circumstances. They're not usually very new creations. All of this suggests that the co-op is not a very competitive model under the current rules. Now, defenders of co-ops will say, well, if that's the case, then the current rules need to be changed. Well, if you have a socialist government that can change the rules in those ways, aren't there other ways you might change the rules? Aren't there other kinds of ways of organizing business that you might impose? And why do you need a co-op to encourage more benevolent labor policy if you already have the political power to create and instantiate co-ops? At that point, just use your political power to create more benevolent labor policy. Why do you need a co-op to raise minimum wages if you have the power to politically create space for co-ops? Just politically raise the minimum wage. So it's kind of, on the one hand, they'll say, well, co-ops are good because co-ops will get you other things. But we don't have co-ops to begin with. So to get them, we would need some kind of political intervention. And if we could make that political intervention, then we don't need the co-ops to get us that political intervention because we've already got it. Am I making sense?
Yeah, I mean, I was saying to Benjamin earlier, it's like this bizarre way of like trying to win before you win. And I feel like a lot of people sort of lean on UBI in similar ways. And I get really fucking frustrated by UBI because the way I conceive of it is really simple. It's that by the time we were able to demand a UBI worth having, right, one that was sufficiently high as to actually provide a floor for people to live with or without work, then we've already won. Like, if if we're able to demand a UBI worth having, one that is in fact post-work, well, then we're already in a position of class power, of political power, sufficient that why are we talking about something as uninspiring and banal as a UBI, right?
Right. So you can't argue that we need co-ops to build class power if class power is the only thing that can make it possible for us to build co-ops at scale.
Precisely. It's just this circular argument.
That's a fundamental contradiction. And the same thing happens with UBI. So we can safely dispense with that argument because under current conditions, co-ops are not predominant. They're not especially prevalent. And the co-ops that do exist have a lot of troubling features. Earlier, before we got on, Aimee and I were talking about the Mondragon co-op in Spain, and we briefly did a little bit of looking into that. And I was really, I shouldn't say surprised because I'm not really surprised, but I was saddened by some of the things that we discovered about Mondragon.
I mean, I just find it kind of funny because we were attempting to pay lip service or homage or whatever to Richard Wolff, who's a big stan of co-ops. And I was saying to Benjamin, like, maybe you should at least, like, pay lip service to, like, his arguments, you know, like, because I imagine people are familiar with him, like, you know, and he's a big advocate of them. I'm sure he has good arguments. Anyway, I remembered having read about him advocating Mondragon in The Guardian a few years back. Incidentally, it was just before they went belly up a number of years ago. So it was in 2012.
And not all of them, but a significant piece of their holdings went under in, I think, 2012 or 2013.
Yeah.
It was Fagor. Fagor went belly up.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, they did that in order to sort of save it, I believe. So in 2012, Richard Wolff was singing the praises of Mondragon as, you know, a co-op, and co-ops are the method of, you know, making the work much less exploitative, far more equal, etc., etc. Now, that was 2012. The following year, Spain's largest appliance maker, Fagor, which is a subsidiary of Mondragon, the world's biggest group of worker-owned cooperatives, they went bankrupt. And I mean, it was not a huge shock given the crisis in Spain in that era. But Mondragon had won a bunch of awards and a shit ton of praise as an alternative to shareholder capitalism, and sort of had, you know, been cited by many people on the left as, like, you know, the shining example.
And people just ignore that it comes out of the Franco era, an era when Spain was not really trading with anybody after it had been excluded from the Marshall Plan. It ignores that completely. And it ignores that even when it was coming out of this period, when Spain was not really trading with people, and theoretically, therefore, because it was a closed economy, there wasn't much international competition, co-ops did not become the predominant feature in Spain. They, again, played only a peripheral role, which is why you hear about Mondragon and not the entire Spanish economy, because only this one particular firm stood out as an example of what had come out of that period. And so even in Spain, even in the climate where Mondragon was created, a climate that was very favorable to the creation of alternative kinds of economic structures because of the extent to which Spain was economically isolated, co-ops did not become the predominant form of firm organization.
Right. And so in the lead up to that going bust, Fagor had lost money for 5 consecutive years. They'd run up debts of $1.2 billion. Their sales had dropped off a cliff, at least in part due to low-cost competition from Asia, and even pay cuts of over 20% had not been enough to turn it around. And so ultimately, they were bankrupted. But meantime, the other parts of the other subsidiaries of Mondragon remained intact, but despite being referred to as a series of worker co-ops, if you actually dig under the hood a little bit, there's a whole lot about the way they're operating now that is in fact far more in line with a fairly standard capitalist employment firm.
Firstly, a lot of the people who work for them are not actually part of the co-op. So there are worker owners, but then there are also employees of the co-op who are not worker owners. So there's a two-tier system. And so particularly if you're not in Spain, if you're someone who works for one of the subsidiaries out in, say, Latin America, you don't get included.
No, not at all. So they have what they call their 10 principles. They're like a set of ideals for the operation of cooperatives. They were originally set out by the Rochdale Society in England in 1844, but they come to be a fairly standardized set of cooperative principles that are fairly normal in cooperatives across the world. And the 10 principles have now been reduced to 6, and they are 1, open voluntary membership. 2, democratic governance. 3, limited return on equity. 4, surplus belongs to members. 5, education of members and public in cooperative principles. 6, cooperation between cooperatives. So in something like Mondragon, for example, you could have cooperation between other, basically divisions within the broader company, within the broader set of cooperatives. But they're not under any kind of obligation to be cooperative or inclusive or have any of those principles apply to anyone outside of the firm. And so even in Richard Wolff's article, he sort of, this I found particularly fascinating. So, Mondragon has a rule that all enterprises are to source their inputs from the best and least costly producers, whether or not those are also MC enterprises. And this has kept MC at the cutting edge of new technologies. So let me just break that down for you. And I find it kind of shocking that Wolff, as an economist, did not at this point think to mention that what that ultimately means in a globalized economy where the workers are trying to run their firm in a competitive fashion, what that means is they are sourcing their inputs from the least costly producers who are generally overseas. Overseas in places like South America and Asia, where workers are not working for cooperative firms, but for capitalist firms. And they're being ruthlessly and brutally exploited at those capitalist firms. Because that is how they're able to be the, quote, least costly producers.
And that's the only way that firm can survive. It can only survive by having this grisly underbelly where it participates in all the worst practices that anybody has ever complained about in terms of the relationship between Western transnational corporations and their foreign subsidiaries and suppliers. And so for socialists to pretend that this is in any way significant as an improvement, it just doesn't hold any weight whatsoever. So we went trying to steelman this argument, and we end up with this absolute sewage as the go-to example from a prominent advocate who thinks that this is socialism.
And to clarify,
what kind of world are we living in?
Yeah, let's think about it for a brief second. It's not just a recommendation, it is a rule, an MC rule, that all enterprises are to source their inputs from the best and least costly producers, whether or not they're MC enterprises. What this means is that the workers in the cooperative are obliged to one another as a collective to be the most ruthlessly exploitative towards overseas workers. You compare that to, for instance, steel and car workers in unions, or any form of work, manufacturers in a manufacturers union. What are they incentivized to do? They're incentivized to band together and leverage their power against the boss in ways that are anathema to the boss taking production overseas and ruthlessly
Unions at
exploiting.
different firms work together through solidarity.
Yeah.
You look at something like the United Auto Workers Union, it's not the workers at Ford versus the workers at GM versus the workers at Chrysler. It's all of those workers across the whole industry together. And when you really have it cooking up nicely, you get workers from different sectors helping each other out in times of strike. But this not only vitiates cross-sector cooperation, it also vitiates solidarity within the industry. Because under the rules, to be one of the worker owners, you have to be willing to screw over people who are not worker owners at your firm, which means you have to be willing to screw over people who work in the same kinds of jobs, in the same kinds of industries alongside you. You have to be willing to screw over people who work at potential supply outfits.
And you're literally obliged to pick the most ruthlessly exploitative developing nations firms to provide parts for whatever you're making.
Which means when you're trying to decide where to source your parts, you're saying to the developing countries of the world, whichever one of you succeeds in forcing your workers to work for the least amount of money, such that you can do this at the cheapest possible price. That's where our co-op will send its business.
Yeah, it's no commitment to seeking only union-made parts or only MC co-op parts. No. It is find the most brutal, ruthlessly exploitative factory anywhere in the developing world. And that is a rule. It is a rule that we get our parts from them. And moreover, given that up to 50% of their employees in the supermarket sector are in fact no longer cooperative members or employee owners, right? They're just regular staff like you or I. You literally have a second-class employee status. They're literally not just obliged to be ruthless with people outside of their own workplace, but now that they have non-member employees within their own workplace, you have a two-tier status where they are encouraged to more brutally exploit their peers because some of their peers have ownership and some of them don't.
It reminds me of the creation of the professional class as separate and distinct from the working class. And of course, the aim in that is to legitimate the capitalist system by bringing a small number of people into it and making them think of themselves as owners in it. And it also reminds me of stock options, where the firm pretends that you can be part of it because they'll give you some stock in the firm. And then you get to have an interest in perpetuating whatever exploitative relationships the firm has. Because if you do a good job, you get dividends and your stock value goes up.
But at least then you have functional hierarchy and the fucking thing can respond to the market because it's still in a market. Whereas this is the worst of both worlds.
Yeah, so that's the other side of this that we haven't really gotten into yet. And we touched on this a little bit, but I want to talk about why direct democracy, which is really what this is meant to be. Why direct participatory democracy is just not a great way to run pretty much anything. And this may be a controversial position because these days direct democracy is very popular with a lot of people. But honestly, if you look at what direct democracy does, it still results in quite hierarchical relationships, but these relationships are informal and aren't institutionally evident. So, for instance, in Athens, in the Athenian direct democracy, what you see is a series of different orators, people who have a lot of social capital, and are charismatic and know how to express themselves in the way that fits that period, gathering followers around themselves and pursuing political careers as demagogues. And this produced a debate in Athens between the philosophers and the rhetoricians. The rhetoricians said, well, if philosophers want to have influence in our city, then what philosophers should do is learn how to use rhetoric so that they can convince the people of their arguments. And the philosophers said, well, if we talked in whatever way was popular, that would require us to change the way that we argue and the way that we think, to play to base impulses, to manipulate people's emotions, to screw around with them in all kinds of ways. And perhaps you recall the word pathos as a rhetorical technique from Greek thought, which is about triggering and manipulating the emotions in the audience, which the demagogues always traded upon. And the philosophers said, if we went to rhetoric schools and learned how to express ourselves in this way, we would cease to be doing philosophy. We would at that point become like the demagogues. And rather than use rhetoric to persuade people of philosophy, our attempt to use rhetoric would instead debase our own ability to think and argue. And if you've ever done, say, high school speech and debate, you probably know what I'm talking about. I remember being in debate, and the need to win in debate, because it's a competition, it's a contest, causes you to think in terms of what ways of speaking will be well received and what ways of speaking won't be well received. And so instead of having a debate that is about trying to get at the truth, you have this adversarial relationship with an opponent, and your goal is to manipulate the audience into liking you and disliking your opponent, regardless of how much that requires you to step on the truth. And if you've watched politics, representative politics in representative democracies, this is, of course, how it's conducted. Political candidates say whatever is necessary to make themselves popular and to make their opponents less popular. And they play this demagogic role. So this is where you go, well, wait a second, Benjamin. I thought you were saying that direct democracy was especially pernicious, and now you're telling me that in representative democracy the same thing happens. And yes, that's true. The difference is that in representative democracy, there are offices that are specifically delineated. Those offices have specifically delineated powers. They're on a specifically delineated electoral cycle. There are mechanisms for picking candidates, for picking primary candidates, for parties in Europe appoint particular people to run for posts. There are party manifestos. There's clear statements of intent and purpose. People have websites where they tell you what they intend to do. You can hold those people to account because when the election time comes, then you can specifically target specific individuals. You know what specific powers they have and which powers you're either trying to give them or trying to take away. You know what they've done, whether they've done what they said they would do. You have all of this architecture which enables you to hold people accountable if you pay attention and you work at it. In a direct democracy, you don't have any of this architecture because in a direct democracy, no one is supposed to have more power than anyone else. Representatives have more power than the people they represent, and therefore direct democracy rejects all of that. But what happens is you still end up getting some people who are much more powerful than other people, but they're just demagogic orators without any institutionalized position. So a little while ago...
Let me give a really, really easy to understand example. So, I don't know if anyone remembers Survivor, but I think it's a really perfect example of what happens with direct democracy, where at the end of the week you get some form of voting to boot somebody, right? Imagine the booting was firing. And then imagine the most manipulative motherfuckers on that program who use their charm and charisma to manipulate other people to do their bidding. The type of people who win or, are in the top few contestants. Those are the type of motherfuckers who end up dictating things in a direct democracy. Well, like if everyone just has one vote, there's no representatives, then you just end up getting like the most manipulative people having just absurdly outsized power, right?
Through social networks, through peer networks,
through social,
not through anything that you can see.
Capital,
it's all invisible.
All
hierarchies
invisible.
Of coolness.
All glad
all hierarchies of coolness.
Whoever's the most charming, the most persuasive.
It's the networkers. Right? And we worry about this in representative democracy, but at least we have some tools in representative democracy to challenge it and keep an eye on it. In direct democracy, all of this is informalized, and therefore all of it is difficult to see. I wrote a blog post a little while ago about the Pittsburgh DSA, about this DSA branch that was taken over by a clique which was initially not elected to its board and which managed to get itself into power through sustained campaigns of harassment, where they would drop lists of people who were problems for them and specifically target them with online social media harassment, sometimes even in-person personal harassment, where someone came into a meeting and just took the microphone and accused everyone, the whole organization, of being racist. And the organization buckled in response to this totally extra procedural intervention and held a series of meetings where they allowed this person to tell them how the organization should change itself so that it's less racist. The particular person, as it turns out, is a centrist Democrat who's been involved in all kinds of centrist organizations in Pittsburgh. But that didn't matter because the organization was intimidated by her speech. So what you get is you get these people who have not been given any formalized power, operating in a clandestine way through hierarchies of coolness and social networking and the manipulation of social norms, for instance, like the norm that when a black person says that an organization is racist, you stop and you listen to that. They take advantage of these social norms and they use them to get control of the organization. Not for the purposes of necessarily making anything any different, but purely so that they can run it. And all of this occurs until you get to a point where at the Pittsburgh DSA, they vote to throw out their entire board and replace it with an entirely new board. So because there's no scheduled election system, you can just have a referendum to replace your board. If someone can whip up a bunch of people into a rage and get them to call that and manage to sustain that level of energy, then you can get it done. And all of this comes from there being very weak institutional rules within the DSA, both within individual branches and within the whole structure, because, of course, the DSA National has got almost no control over its particular composite branches. And each of the branches is run in such a direct, open fashion that there's very little accountability within the branches, and offices that the branches create can be replaced or uncreated the next day. And people who are not in offices can exercise all kinds of informal decision-making power. And all of this is impossible to identify. And if you write it up, everyone will say, well, you're just telling a bunch of people's version of the story and you're lying about it in all kinds of ways. And they will allege all kinds of stuff because there's no way to check any of this. If you say that a bunch of people are meeting up at somebody's house and they're drawing up lists of enemies that need to be harassed on social media, and everyone who's at that meeting goes, no, of course that didn't happen. There are no minutes. There's nothing to look at because it's an informal meeting occurring among a bunch of people who don't have any formal positions. And they're all friends. And it's just a clique, which is what, by the way, the people who don't like this group of people in Pittsburgh call them, the clique. Like it's a high school gang of friends.
Yeah,
and this is what direct democracy really does.
It's reminiscent of living in a frat house. You're in a permanent hazing week. I fucking hate the idea.
Yeah, and everything we don't
Disturbs
like
the
about
shit
left-wing
out of me.
politics has come out of this direct democracy horizontalist thing. Everything we don't like. The
this is the
Athenians
thing.
even had a word for getting rid of people. You know how we talk about people being canceled?
Cancelled,
The
yeah.
Athenians had the word ostracize, where in ancient Athens they would vote to send someone out of the city because they'd become tired of listening to that person talk or thought that person was a danger to the city. All of the things we don't like about left-wing discourse come from direct democracy, decentralization, and horizontalism.
I mean, the thing
All of
that
the arbitrary power dynamics and abuse, all of it all comes out of this.
And that's before we even talk about the idea of how functionally fucking useless horizontalist organizations are in the face of a globalized market, right? If, like, you look at how fucking useless DSA is. Imagine if DSA was competing not just with, like, you know, vague political organizations or whatever. Like, they can't even get their shit together to do things that are non-competitive. And so, like, they can't even decide what to do on the local level in terms of whether they should do brake lights or, you know, fucking Sunday craft noon hour. So can you imagine how they're
let alone
be
decide who to endorse, let alone decide what kinds of resources to commit to candidates?
Well, this is what I found fucking hilarious. Like, and I was saying it to Benjamin a couple of weeks ago. I was like, it is literally equivalent to, like, you going to your local DSA chapter and all those motherfuckers are your boss and you're forced to work with them all the time. And not only are you forced to work with them, but, like, they're your bosses, you're their bosses. And, like, imagine a workplace where the firm's returns, like their profits, are ones in which you all share. So you're all mutually invested and, like, exploiting each other and making sure each other is more productive. Like, so not
imagine
only
a workplace where everyone is everybody's manager.
Yeah.
Where everybody that you work with
everyone
is your manager.
is a cop all of the fucking time, and you are a cop all of the time. So instead
and this is
of
what
the
is
regular,
happening in the DSA,
yeah.
everyone is a discourse cop on everybody else all the time, and it would be like that, but at work.
Yeah, but it would also be like that, and, like, if everything's dysfunctional, it's not just like, you know, your local grassroots politicking is not successful. It's that literally, like, you fucking can't eat. You can't work. Like, if your firm fucks up, that's your livelihood. So you're in this constant state of vigilance for everyone around you.
And in the case of this co-op, it clearly resulted in them feeling that unless they imposed a rule that everyone had to take the most efficient supplier, that some people would, out of kindness or an attempt to, I don't know, build something that's nicer than capitalism, occasionally source products from more expensive but more humane suppliers. And that was such a threat to the livelihood of the people in the co-op that they had to make a rule which expressly not only prohibits taking contracts with exceptionally uncompetitive suppliers, but requires you to take the most competitive contract.
So the other thing that we've yet to refer to, and that I think I never hear advocates of co-ops referring to, is the idea of inequality writ large. So what is often peddled is the notion that, you know, democratizing the workplace increases equality within the firm. And this is really good because everyone's equal and, you know, you get equal pay and blah, 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 horizontalism, equality. But what they don't talk about is the idea that there would, in fact, be stark inequalities between both different firms and different regions. So you're going to find there's going to be inequality between firms in different industries because some industries are labor intensive and some are capital intensive. And so if you have something that is, say, capital intensive, but not labor intensive. So say you're making, like, financial products, or, fuck knows what, but something that is not labor intensive but is capital intensive means you're going to have
something where you get the machines up and running and then you don't need very many people.
Exactly. So you're going to have a small number of workers relative to the profit being generated, as opposed to something that is, say, labor intensive, where you're going to have a great number of workers relative to the profit being generated. So say something like, producing fresh produce and that sort of thing. It means that workers in firms that are labor intensive as opposed to capital intensive are going to be in positions of really stark inequality compared to workers in other firms. And and
to put it in a kind of straightforward way.
Yeah. And I don't
if
hear
you imagine
about this.
Yeah. If you imagine like a textile industry, and one textile industry is 1,000 people at looms, and another textile industry is half of that or a quarter of that at electronic sewing machines. Okay? And imagine that they both sell the same amount of cloth at the same price. The workers at the electrified, automated, industrialized textile firm will receive much larger amounts of money than the workers at the handloom firm, because there are a smaller number of workers to divide the profit among at the more technologically advanced firm. Right? Now that is within one industry. And of course, in real life, very quickly the sewing machine firm outcompetes and destroys the handloom firm. But you get what we're talking about? There are some industries, some sectors, some firms where you can have a smaller number of workers for the amount of output. And there are other firms, other sectors, other industries where you need a larger amount of workers for the same amount of output. And whereas in other situations, you may have various kinds of redistributive mechanisms that might be able to help you deal with that inequality. In the case of co-ops, if you think that co-ops are necessary and sufficient for some kind of equality or justice, you're still going to be left with massive, massive distributive problems.
Well,
and that's even putting aside the other thing that we talked about earlier about how co-ops tend to hire second-class workers in foreign states to source stuff for them. So you've got that too. Workers in other states that are poorer states not having much negotiating leverage when doing business with co-ops in richer states.
Yeah, and I also think that democratic participation, like internally, will, I think, provide, and this is me hypothesizing here, but I do get the sense that there's very real risk that could provide, I think, moral cover for deeply, really repugnant behavior. So the type of thing that on an individual level you might be less inclined to do. There's a lot of, evidence within social psychology that if you have like the assent and the kind of social cover of this being for the greater good or for the collective good, but in fact what you're doing is deeply repugnant, there's a lot of social psych evidence that would suggest you'll be willing to do things that are not just like bad, but are actually far worse than you would be prepared to do in isolation, right?
Yeah.
So it provides
so in a
kind of
world full
moral
of co-ops,
cover
the co-ops
for
will
more
all exploit each other.
exploitative. Yeah.
And they'll all exploit each other the same way firms exploit populations in other places, and firms exploit each other.
But possibly
all
even
of this
worse.
will be covered over in it being democratic and it being for the good of the workers.
Yeah.
And at least right now, we all don't identify with all of this, because those of us who don't own capital and aren't employers can't claim that we're part of it. And so that gives us more basis for feeling alienated from all of that. And that makes it easier for us to criticize it.
Well, that's what I was just going to say.
Once you're invited to become part of it.
Yeah, I think this thoroughly mystifies class antagonism, the risk of getting nerdy. Like, I think it thoroughly confuses in a material way it confuses you about what the problems are, who the issue is, and what structures you should be targeting at. And it also deludes you into not aligning with your peers against capital, but aligning with your peers against other workers.
Yeah, because
that's the fundamental trajectory of this.
Yeah, because when you have hierarchical firms, then it's easy to see who the representative of capital and capitalism is. It's the boss.
It's clear.
The boss man is the clear.
Enemy. Yep.
Right. But once you get rid of the boss man, then you have capitalism without the boss man. And capitalism without the boss man gives you no person to organize around, because
you're all each other's boss.
Right. So it's all confused, and there's no focal point for resentment, because everyone will say to you, well, if you don't like it, why don't you, in the same way that they say if you complain about your local DSA chapter, if you don't like it, why don't you participate more? Why don't you go to more of the meetings?
Work harder.
Why don't you contribute to our discussion more? Why don't you work harder?
Work harder.
Yeah.
Work harder.
And everybody's going to say that to you at work, because everybody at work has an interest in you working as hard as possible and complaining as little as possible.
They won't even need to say it. It'll be this subtle fucking specter haunting the workplace.
Yeah, it will just be a kind of totalitarian, horrifying
It's totalitarian,
norm.
Totally. It's everyone is a cop.
Yeah.
Everyone around you is a cop, and then you need to be as ruthless and brutal as fuck with all suppliers, anyone outside of the firm. So
it's Kafkaesque. It's
horrifying.
Absolutely
it scares the living
terrifying.
fuck out of me. Like instead of co-ops, you take one O out. It's cops. This is just cops. Like, for anyone who's read like Freddie Du Bois' Planet of Cops, this is just, to me, like just a more like full-on and fucking intensified version of that, with a complete mystification and confusion of what the fuck the issues with capitalism are.
Yeah, and so what's worrying to me is you have so many people who are socialists or of the left, or claim to be socialists or of the left, who think that democratizing the workplace just fixes all of it. And they don't see this problem. They don't see how democracy is still compatible with exploitation, oppression, and all kinds of horror. And that simply reorganizing the decision-making mechanic doesn't necessarily fix that. And in many respects, it can potentially make it worse.
Yep.
In many respects. Because the coercion is just harder to see, harder to hold to account. Because you yourself are implicated in it. Because everyone you might confide in at work is part of it. And what it says to me is that we are so lost in our ability to think through the implications of our proposals that we end up, in an attempt to get away from capitalism, advocating for things which intensify everything we hate about it.
Yeah, I mean, we're all fucking...
Where the solution is just to make it worse. And I see this also with people who call themselves left or call themselves socialists who like Andrew Yang's UBI.
I can't. I think a huge portion of it is a strain of like libertarian / anarchist, like anarcho-liberals, anarcho-libertarian style so-called socialists. But I feel like to a large extent,
because if you start with that,
I can't.
The individual analysis. If you start with the individual analysis and you go, well, right now I don't have power because I don't have any say. I don't have a vote. And that's as far as the analysis goes.
Yeah, I was trying to, because I was sort of getting the shits with people and their approach to co-ops recently. And I was trying to think sort of what was going on. What was the appeal of them? Because to me, it seems so fucking obvious that they literally don't attend to any of the actual problems with, that structural relationship, that coercive relationship wherein you must work in order to survive. They do fucking absolutely nothing for that. They do nothing in terms of like changing the relations of like class relations and not attended to. They fuck things up almost worse in terms of like being really like rigid, unable to like centralize anything, but then you don't even have like I just think they fundamentally confuse so many things that I couldn't figure out what it was about them that is appealing. And then I remembered a few months back I was reading the New Yorker did a glowing profile of a philosopher known as Elizabeth Anderson, who I encountered in undergrad and never really liked much of what she said. I found it mostly kind of contradictory and confused. But reading this New Yorker article, it sort of struck me, and I want to read a couple of bits from it that would just help make my point. So this is in December 31st, 2018. The philosopher redefining equality. Elizabeth Anderson thinks we've misunderstood the basis of a free and fair society. So, in the summer of 1979, Elizabeth Anderson, then a rising junior at Swarthmore College, got a job as a bookkeeper, blah, blah, blah. Bookkeeper at a bank in Harvard Square. Every morning, she and the other bookkeepers would process a large stack of bounce checks. Blah, blah, blah. When companies were short of funds, Anderson noticed, they would always bounce their payroll checks. It made a cynical kind of sense. A worker who was owed money wouldn't go anywhere or could be replaced, while an unpaid supplier would stop supplying. Still, Anderson found it disturbing that businesses would write employees phony checks, burdening them with bounce fees. It appeared to happen all the time. Midway through summer, the bank changed its plan. Blah, 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 blah. Ultimately, in the late 70s that summer, they reorganized the banking office such that cubicles were added. The transformation interrupted the workflow, the conversation flow, and most other things about bookkeepers' days. Blah, blah, blah. These problems nagged at Anderson that summer and beyond. She'd arrived at college as a libertarian who wanted to study economics. In the spirit of liberal arts exploration, though, she enrolled in an introductory philosophy course whose reading list, this makes me want to fucking commit seppuku, in an introductory philosophy course whose reading list included Karl Marx's 1844 manuscripts concerning worker alienation. Anderson thought that Marx's economic arguments about the declining rate of profit and the labor theory of value fell apart under scrutiny. But she was stirred by his observational writings about the experience of work. Her summer at the bank drove home the fact that systemic behavior inside the workplace was part of the socioeconomic fabric too. It mattered whether you were the person who got a clear check or a bounce check, whether a hierarchy made it easier or harder for you to excel and advance. Yet, economists had no way of factoring those influences into their thinking. Blah, blah, blah. The nature of the workplace, where most people spent half their lives, was a black box. Blah, blah, blah. She liked how philosophy approached big problems. Blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so basically, she decided that the bank experience showed you how you could be oppressed by hierarchy, working in an environment where you are neither free nor equal. But this implied that freedom and equality were bound together in some way beyond the basic state of being unenslaved, which was an unorthodox notion. Blah, blah, blah. So what she ultimately decided, what if most of us think about equality and freedom in a way that's incorrect? And so she basically spent the next 40 years creating a democratic frame for a society in which people come from different places and are predisposed to disagree. Basically, everyone wants to be respected and esteemed by others. So how can you make that compatible with a society of equals? So, we should make workplaces where people don't feel disrespected. You shouldn't have to, as a woman in the workplace, wear, a pantsuit and pantyhose and shoulder pads. You know, you should be allowed to wear pants rather than a skirt. That makes you feel more like you can be yourself in the workplace. Hierarchies of esteem could be compatible with equality.
Right. So it sounds to me like a big legitimation dance.
Of course.
Where what you're doing is you're trying to change the way people feel about something which, from a material point of view, is the same thing.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
And this is fart-huffed by liberals all of the fucking time. Of course it does. Look at Silicon Valley with its stupid foosball tables, on-site masseuses, fucking free food in the cafeteria. And you now just pay for everything with script and live in a fucking retardo village of all other Zuckerberg's drones just like you. But you got a foosball table. It feels nicer. We have workspaces. We don't have cubicles. You can even get one of those standing desks. Hey, look, we've got fucking beanbags.
So you're saying that workplace democracy is a beanbag?
Well, it's just bullshit. You can't, like, this idea that the subjective experience of the workplace is what needs to be changed. If you change the experience of the worker, hierarchies of esteem, make the worker feel respected. Make them feel listened to. Make them feel seen. Make them feel heard. What word am I mentioning a whole fucking lot? Feel. Do you know what's really deeply, perniciously compatible with neoliberalism and neoliberal acceleration?
What, Aimee?
Weaponized affect. If you make people feel things, it distracts them from the brutal inequality in the structures in society. Since the cultural motherfucking turn, we don't look at structures, we don't look at the material, we look at feelings and affect and sentiment and your subjective lived experience. We look at your trauma. We want you to #tell your story. We want you to feel seen and heard and also respected and also believed. Women should be believed. We feel
so if you don't like the way the co-op is managing your employee experience,
we understand that you feel
to the deliberation.
You feel that. We want to make you feel like this is a nice place where you feel welcome, where you can feel heard, where we can mystify the motherfucking fact that you are a wage slave all of the fucking time with silly shit. Anyway, so my point being that I just think we are all thoroughly neoliberal subjects. And the people who advance co-ops, with perhaps the exception of Wolf, I don't want to speak to his motivations. I think he seems good and pure of heart, but I just fundamentally disagree. But I think
a lot of people are good and pure of heart. It's just that it's hard to see your way outside of this logic, this ontology, and this self-understanding.
Yeah, what I'm saying is that we are all neoliberal subjects, and what I think neoliberalism does is that conditions us fundamentally to think in subjective ways, because that's the prevailing, neoliberal individualism is hegemony. It's the prevailing logic of our time. And the more that identitarian discourse is wrapped up, that goes hand in hand with all this feelings shit and subjectivity shit. And so you get to a point where rather than talking about socialism as some kind of, broad structural critique that can only be remedied through fundamentally centralized structural changes to the relations of production, we instead are okay with changing the relations at work, just the relations that we have with our boss. So you take the bad man away, you take the villain away, and everything's better. You make your work experience better. You don't have to sit there and have the cubicles spring up. You make, your workplace is democratized. Democracy is good. This is good. This is what we need. My experience will be better.
But it's kind of like what we were talking about on the first side, where we were talking about earlier on the episode that is for everybody, how people like Elizabeth Warren and Joe Biden try to come up with the bare minimum. What can they do to get people to buy in? And this, in many respects, is just another proposal for getting people to buy into capitalism. It's, okay, well, what if we get rid of the boss? What if we make you your own boss or make you and your friends the boss? Will you play the capitalist game if we make this change in the structure of the firm?
To my mind, all they've done is outsource the boss. So it's so consummately neoliberal. Like the responsibilization trajectory of neoliberalism, where everything becomes like, self-care, self-governance, like just offloading any costs to this internal
this trick,
responsibilization.
Right?
You need to be responsible. You need to be a fully responsible neoliberal subject. So now
you use socialization in place of hard coercion. So you create subjects that are not only willing to do what you tell them to do, but are now willing to do it without anyone having to tell them to do it.
They don't need to be told anymore.
You create subjects who will tell each other to do it and do it themselves without anyone telling them to do it. And so you call that emancipation from capitalism.
It's so fucking Orwellian. So now, like, it's no longer do they even need to have like a boss? It's now like we've even responsibilized that in much the same way as, we've responsibilized child rearing. We've responsibilized like caring for oneself in ways that, historically, like it is community and collectivities that would care for each other. It would be, communities and collectivities that have responsibility for each other. But instead, like neoliberalism has been like this constant ratchet of responsibilization. That's what discourse is like.
And so is democracy. Democracy is like this too, because what democracy does is it puts it into your individual hands and says, we've given you a vote, we've given you a say, and now you have a responsibility to use that vote, to use that say in various ways. And if you don't, you're derelict, you're irresponsible. And so our attitude to voting and to democracy reflects all of this. And so you get people who live in states that don't care about them and treat them like garbage. And when they say, I don't like how my state treats me, I don't feel like I'm shown any concern at all, everyone says, well, why aren't you voting? Why aren't you more involved in politics? Why don't you do something about it? You don't love it? Leave it. Go move somewhere else. Democracy in many ways served to legitimate a lot of power structures that did not change very much when it was applied politically. And if you think that applying that at the workplace level is going to get you anywhere else, I don't see it. This is not to say that democracy is without institutional advantages. This is not to say that democracy is not without its strengths as a system for making decisions. But don't think that it actually gets you freedom, equality, or emancipation. It doesn't do any of those things. What it gets you is a certain level of dynamism, an ability to change your mind about stuff periodically, an ability to get people out. You've got a representative system.
Choice is overrated.
It is. And most of those choices are not as real as they're made out to be, as we talked about earlier today. There really isn't much of a choice between Joe Biden and Elizabeth Warren. It's what kind of rhetoric do you want wrapped around your same old shtick?
It's cosplay, baby. Legitimation cosplay.
So most of these choices are not really real choices. And while a democracy might open the door to some possibility of making a real choice at the political level, this has been very hard to do. We haven't had a whole lot of success with this over the years. The success we have had has often been fleeting, and it's often been caused by other factors. There's been a lot of war and death involved in democracy's successes.
That, like, in the last
the post-war world's the product of the world wars.
Well, I mean, in the past 50 years, we were told in no uncertain terms that there was another micro-institution that we needed to democratize in order to liberate everyone in really meaningful ways. And I mean, I'm sorry, I hate to say it, this is a point at which I get called crypto-fash or trad life or some shit, but like women's emancipation from, quote, emancipation, the democratization of the family.
Well, there's so many ways to
has
fake
been
free people,
a really, really convenient handmaiden to neoliberal acceleration and to a great deal of motherfucking unhappiness. So I don't think that we should be so daft as to just naively assume that shit that sounds good on paper doesn't come without cost. And I'm not implying that, if women remained barefoot in the kitchen, that like the trajectory of capital would have magically been stalled, right? That's fucking ridiculous. What I am saying,
and what Elizabeth Warren argued in the two-income trap.
Yeah, it's absolutely not my point in any way, shape, or form. But I guess we could call it like the 12,000 coworker income trap.
Certainly there's a point to be made that by pushing women into the workforce, they were pushed into a relationship that is exploitative, and they were told that that was liberating. In much the same way that when you make the various colonies around the world independent from the colonial powers, and then you invite them to negotiate sovereign arrangements for how the trade's going to work with those former colonizers. The independence is used as a pretext to subjugate them, because if you're not part of my state, then I don't have any duty to look after you or to care about you. So when you get into a negotiation, if you're an African country with a European state that used to own you, that European state isn't going to negotiate with you in good faith. It's going to attempt to screw you over in every way it can, and you won't have any means for making any kind of political demands on it because you're no longer citizens of that European state.
Kind of like you're no longer... Yeah, like you can no longer demand the Fordist family wage when women are in the workforce.
Right. So the political independence of the colonies in many ways functions like getting rid of the boss by obscuring, which European country is your master, by saying you're free, you're independent. Neocolonialism legitimates and reinscribes all the relations of global injustice which prevailed under colonialism. And in much the same way, you tell, say, women that their liberation comes from the participation in wage slavery, that is going to induce people to get involved in relationships they otherwise might not have gotten involved in that are exploitative.
Be a girl boss. You can have it all. Can you have it all?
There's so many different ways in which the left is manipulated and by itself and by other people into supporting movements of all kinds that reinscribe relations of exploitation and domination in the name of expanding freedom. And it's because if you use an individualist notion of freedom that's very narrow, then you're going to miss the big, collective, large-scale kinds of unfreedom that stem from the pursuit of individual freedom. And the most free place in the world is Mad Max Fury Road. It's the collapse of the state and the plunging of everybody into a violent chaos where everybody can form whatever kinds of organizations they want on an ad hoc basis.
Don't tread on me.
That's the most free kind of society there is from an individualist point of view. But from a more big picture point of view, it's the least free society there is because everyone has to live in fear of everybody else all the time. And that was one of the great insights of Thomas Hobbes.
And
that when you get rid of power structures that are formal, what you end up with is an endless tyranny of informal structures, and you end up constantly in fear and in terror of everybody around you all the time.
Yep. And there is literally nothing cooperative about a co-op. You are surrounded by bosses all of the time, and they're not just bosses in some vague sense. They're literally like your productivity. They are financially invested in you getting shit done.
Individualism can never give you solidarity or community or real cooperation because individualism itself demands that you constantly go, what's in it for me?
A cooperative with capital. That's what they're good for.
They get you to cooperate with the system. Well, I think that's about all that's left.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing left.
What do you think,
There's
Aimee?
nothing left.
Anything else?
About co-ops is what I'm saying.
No. not much left about that at all. To be honest, I think that we came out of this conversation even more opposed to them than
I think that's
we were
right.
when
I
we
was
came in.
maybe 3-4 hours ago before we started planning and executing this. I was neutral. I was like, I don't think they're going to get you to socialism, but I also don't give a fuck. Like, if you want to go to a co-op, do a co-op, don't care. I'm increasingly, and the more research we did about Mondragon and the internal dynamics, I don't even think
initially I thought we were just going to argue that this wasn't a panacea, that this wasn't going to get you to socialism, and that it's not a great final end goal. But now I feel like not only does this not get you to socialism, I feel like this is taking us further down neoliberal acceleration.
I think so too, really, and I firmly believe that. And I also encountered a book with quite a lot of information about the experience of Mondragon workers, and so like even on the individualist dynamic, as in like this will make for a better feeling exploitation. It literally doesn't.
And that's very interesting because what that says is if you tell people that your firm is about making you feel recognized or making you feel democratically represented, then at that point, people start to demand that from the workplace experience. And if it can't deliver on that in a satisfying way, then you're even more dissatisfied than you were before the workplace was promising to meet that expectation.
Again, it's mystification. Like when you go to work with a boss, you have low expectations and it's easy to meet low expectations. But if y'all fed this Pollyanna bullshit that exploitation is in fact legitimated by democratic participation, when in fact it's absolutely motherfucking not, it raises your expectations and then your actual subjective experience of it is worse. In addition to it not doing anything towards any form of transition. So
and
it's
that's really tragic because
fronts.
You'll feel more alienation and resentment.
Again,
here.
like women and men.
Because everyone else at your firm.
Like women and men today.
But because everyone else at your firm has an interest in getting you to go along with it, you won't even be able to talk about it. And so you'll feel more resentment, but you'll feel more isolated and alone than you ever did before.
And that's literally what all the data suggests in this book. It's called The Myth of Mondragon. I'll put a link to it.
So then it won't even
notes.
make for happier slaves. It just makes for sadness and misery, but a sadness and misery whose source is mystified and unidentifiable.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
Well, great work, people who have been promoting co-ops. Really helped us out with that.
Alrighty. Okay. We could probably keep huffing our own farts if we go any further. Bye!
Bye.
Oh my God, I just fucking did it again. What was I going to say? What did you just say to me before? I've got it. Sorry. I know this is really annoying. What did you just say? Oh, okay. Got it. Sorry. I'm so fucking annoying. Okay. Sorry, Adam. Sorry, Benjamin.